I would like to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kalia Garrido, and I head up events and strategic marketing here at Hike2. About Hike2, if you don't already know us, we are a fully functional, best-in-class innovation consultancy. And we specialize in digital transformation strategy, design, and implementations. Our main areas of expertise are in AI, cloud solutions, and around data and analytics. And you are in for a treat today as we have some seriously smart folks ready to share their expertise with this group. But before I begin with an introduction, I'd like to go over some housekeeping. So of course, as we all know, this is a webinar, so your cameras and your microphones are going to remain off, but we do encourage engagement. We would love you to chat with us. You can use the chat or the Q&A function. And if you want to reserve your question for the end of the event, we'll have a little bit of time saved for that. We will indeed be recording, so I know whoever was going to text me and ask me if we were recording, we will be. You can find this video posted on our YouTube channel, along with a plethora of other great innovation forward content, and I'll share that link here soon as well. So this is part one of a three-part series that's going to reflect the levels of maturity that are around the concept of the shared responsibility model. And today we're going to be chatting about the basic structural concepts and how to get started. In our next session, which we've scheduled for January 28th, and of course, we hope you'll join, we're going to take the focus a bit deeper for those who have already implemented basic governance and security in their cloud solutions. And I'll share that link where you can RSVP for that session as well. So without further ado, I'm going to begin by introducing Hike2's own Morgan Llewellyn, who is the moderator of today's session. As the AI practice leader, Morgan, who has a PhD, by the way, he brings over 20 years of expertise and renown in AI strategy and innovation. He has successfully implemented advanced AI solutions for government agencies and Fortune 100 companies alike. And here at Hike2, Morgan drives AI strategies and ensures that the company remains a leader in AI technology and applications. Morgan, thank you so much for leading us through this discussion today.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. It's really a pleasure to be here. And we've got, three really great panelists today who really bring a wealth of experience across different security concepts and kind of knowledge sets. And so let me go ahead and let them introduce themselves briefly. Gary, do you mind introducing yourself? And then, we can go to Adam and then call Deep just to kick off.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Palmatier, CEO at Red Argyle. I'm a Salesforce MVP Community Hall of Famer. Been in the ecosystem since 2008, and I've been consulting on Salesforce actively at Red Argyle since 2012. Happy to be here.
Hey, everybody. My name's Adam Franklin. I'm a technical architect here at Hike2, working primarily within Salesforce for the past decade or so. Prior to that, was working with international customers across supply chain and manufacturing. So, spent a lot of time thinking about compliance and regulations and all the things that go into feeding that, and excited to be here today.
I'll take it over from Adam. So my name is Kuldeep Singh. I am with Hike2. Here for Hike2, I am a director and a chief data officer. I work in the data and analytics practice. My career has mostly been in data and analytics. I have about 23 years in this space, about 15 years or so in financial services. So pretty much familiar with all capabilities that are related to data analytics, recently data science, machine learning. So very excited about this very critical concept that we're going to talk about today. So a pleasure to be here. Hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So let's go ahead and get right into it because, as Kelly mentioned at the top of the call, this is part of a three-part series. And so this is really about an introduction and kind of the starting point where a lot of firms might be at or where they might be, thinking of getting started. So Gary, kind of to set the tone and kind of, put a floor around the conversation. When you think about a shared responsibility model, some people might not be familiar with that concept, but it's been with us for a long time at this point. What is a shared, kind of responsibility model, and how does that apply to organizations today?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that's a great place to start. So I'll give you an analogy. Maybe everyone, at least everyone here who has a driver's license, might get it. If you have a car, we'll say a Volvo. Everyone knows Volvo is a super safe car. Goes through all these safety tests. Government puts its stamp of approval on it and says, "All right, this car is certified to get on the road." We all know that's a safe car. Then you get the keys, and then you drive away from the dealership with your Volvo. The shared responsibility in that transaction is Volvo is certified, like, we're giving you a platform that is secure to do your driving in, but you are responsible for how you drive that car. And if we translate that concept to technology, we see the same thing with a lot of the cloud-based platforms that we work with, where platform itself is secure, maintained at very high standards, but at some point you're getting handed the keys to that platform, and you have some responsibility yourself to use that correctly.
And so when you talk about different clouds, is the shared responsibility model, is that across every cloud? Is it specific to certain clouds? What about people who have, maybe some of their own private implementation? How do you think of, how broadly does that extend, that shared responsibility model?
I mean, my experience, which, as you know, we're primarily focused on the Salesforce platform. On the Salesforce perspective, it's absolutely a core of an operating model when you're using Salesforce as a platform. Salesforce is going to take it to a certain degree, and then you're, again, as an admin of a Salesforce org and an owner, you've got to figure out how to implement it wisely. Other platforms, again, they may have different marketing and communications around it. Salesforce does a pretty good job of calling that out explicitly in some of its communications, but I think the challenge is with so many platforms out there, each platform company talks about it differently. But when you boil it all the way down, it's you have to take responsibility for what's going on in the cloud, whether you own it or not.
Yeah, and so when we think about data, let's start with data. I think a large focus of this conversation is going to be around AI. But when we think about data and we think about what data we put into, the cloud, Kuldeep, Adam, how should we be thinking about the shared responsibility model in terms of the data that we're putting in? What are we responsible for, and what is what is our cloud provider kind of guaranteeing, or what ownership are they taking in that responsibility model as far as data is concerned?
Kuldeep, do you want to go first? I can follow.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Great question, Morgan. I think this is the question I had for myself. About 5 years back, I used to work for a large financial services organization, and we had spent a year looking at cloud service providers and what they were offering, right? Because the bank obviously was nervous about moving their data into the cloud. So we'd spent a lot of time with both Azure and AWS in trying to understand what's their data center methodology, right? What are the services that are already built up, and what is really the definition of infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. Back in the days, the bank had their own data center. We also had co-location. So we're just doing all sorts of, infrastructure level comparison at all layers of infrastructure, right? Servers, compute, you're looking at, security, IAM, which is your access management, your encryption methodologies. Very quickly, and I was a silent observer because most of the people who were talking in the room were infrastructure, data center, CTO organizations, right? I mean, I was coming more from a data and analytics standpoint. Very early on, I realized that a lot of that burden is eventually going to fall on me, right? Especially for data, right? I'm only talking about data. And over the last 5 years, as my thought process has evolved, that has continued to stay static. When you talk about your core data, right? And then, of course, data has different definitions. It could be a public, something that can be easily made available to the public versus some of your most critical data, right? I mean, how do you manage all of that? So I got a different perspective, but the perspective really was that if you are in a company, you are head of your data, you are responsible for your data, no matter where you fall in the spectrum of the shared service, responsibility model. I'll hand it over to you, Adam.
I couldn't agree more with you, Kuldeep. I think that at its core, the shared responsibility model, the data is always the customer's responsibility. I think about this often in terms of risk and how aware of the risks are we. If we're talking about a software as a service offering, there's one level of risk, but a lot of that risk is being managed by the vendor. As we go further along down the road, right, it's basically you have more opportunities to probably not meet all your responsibilities. And so when I think about the responsibility, it's both, yeah, ultimately you are responsible for the data as the business, but also you're responsible for understanding those boundaries are, which is kind of the core of the whole shared responsibility model. It's not simply you or the business and the vendor, but also where does that line get drawn between, okay, the vendor is going to give you X and you're responsible for Y. There's a sliding scale. And Kuldeep, I think you mentioned, infrastructure as a service. Like that's kind of the most extreme example where I'm basically almost responsible for everything as if I were putting this on site. Whereas if I go over to the other side and it's, a SaaS offering, maybe the possible ways that I could inadvertently expose data to the outside world is pretty limited because they've just designed it that way. I have less control, but I also have, less areas of risk.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that.
So this can get very complicated very quickly, is what I'm kind of seeing here. In a lot of these terms, infrastructure as a service, and the governance that you're discussing, is very complicated. And I guess the question I have for each of you is, thinking about, we've got, maybe an audience who they're looking to get started, or they're trying to understand, what are the simple steps that they can take. Kind of starting with you, Gary, when you're working with, Salesforce professionals or cloud professionals, CIOs, et cetera, and you're talking about security in the context of the shared responsibility model, where does that conversation usually start? And what are some of like the first things that an organization should consider, or maybe some, for lack of a better term, quick wins an organization can have? And then Kuldeep and Adam, I'll ask the same question from both of you too.
Yeah, I'll talk about real quick how I introduce those discussions, and then step one for me. It's going to sound scary, but I'm a big fan of the NIST cybersecurity model, which NIST is the National Institute Standards of Technology. I like the NIST model because it's got 5 core tenets. The first tenet is literally the word identify. It's, do you even know what you have going on in your organization that could be considered a cybersecurity risk? And from the effort of performing identification, it starts to give you a blueprint of where to put energy for defining the rest of your cybersecurity strategy. So if I take it back to the question about data, one of my first foundational exercises that I like to take our customers through is called data classification, where an organization performs an inventory of its data. And that can be handled a few different ways. There can be a higher level data classification where it's just like, what clouds am I working with right now, all the way down to a lower level data classification of what's my schema and what are the fields there and what is each field classified as an example. Social security number, we all know, is a pretty risky piece of data to have floating around unmanaged in your infrastructure. So when we go through classification, we can identify all those areas of risk, which then a company can say, okay, now I know where these potential issues are, and we can start working on the rest of the strategy around it.
Well, that's fantastic. So start with identify. I think that's really helpful. Adam, Kuldeep, when you're thinking about, kind of the shared responsibility model and where to start a conversation, where do you typically start, and how do you think about that?
So
Yeah, thanks.
I typically want to start by understanding, much like Gary was saying, right, what is the data that you actually have? And lately the conversation has also been, well, what rules and regulations are you legally obligated to be in compliance with? Setting aside anything else, like what's the bare minimum you need to do to avoid getting fined or worse? And usually that kind of opens up a lot of different avenues. It's hard to think of something original to say here because I think Gary said it so well that really a lot of this is starting with just, okay, what are you actually doing? What are you capturing? And then also how is that controlled? I guess that would be the next level that I tend to be very interested in is like, how do you know who's getting to this data right now? Like what mechanisms do you have in place for that? Whether it's what tools are you using and what kind of functionality do they provide for, enabling or disabling access? And, going even further, like, do you have a process in place to do that? And that can be a very long conversation. It's a big lift to actually implement that. But I think starting that conversation as early as possible in any discussion is really critical.
Yeah, so I like that layer you added to it, Adam, of after identifying what are the types and the sources of information you have and what risk might be associated with just having that type of information. Now there's an underlying risk of who has access to that information. And there's a secondary kind of risk there. I think that's really interesting. Kuldeep, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think, just supporting what Adam and Gary have already mentioned. I mean, it's not like we are new to managing, right? I mean, we have been managing our infrastructure, our data, our most critical data, our regulators, our encryption methodologies, right? I mean, we have been doing that whole stack. We've been doing real-time monitoring. Now it's just a matter of kind of saying that, if I had the good fortune of building something which is a brand new landing zone in the cloud, how am I going to build that stack? And that's where you kind of, look at the capabilities that you need, right? I always kind of go back to, hey, if I was building this data organization from scratch, right, and infrastructure from scratch, what are the capabilities that I need? And those capabilities have not changed, right? It's just that who is building them for you, right? Starting with what Gary said, right? I mean, classification of your data. Gary, you mentioned access management. What are your encryption methodologies, right? How are you going to kind of, monitor? Data integrity is a huge deal, right? Because at the end of the day, we haven't started talking about AI yet. But if you don't have integrity in your data, right, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, how are you going to do data quality up there, right? And how are you going to kind of, manage GDPRs and the HIPAAs? And while the cloud platforms provide you the basic infrastructure, which are, attuned to the GDPRs and the regulations, et cetera, but the workflows and, your metrics and your KPIs. So just thinking at a high level from your capabilities and then starting to map, that's I think Adam already mentioned, that's a long kind of a conversation. It takes a while, especially for organizations who are starting new. They're nervous about all of that, but it's a good thing to do is to go out there and almost do a PhD and all of that. And the cloud vendors are ready. I mean, they have been dealing with this for years now, right, to have that conversation with you.
Yeah, and I would like us to talk about, kind of the elephant in the room and the tech disruption that's being brought by generative AI. But before we do that, and before we introduce that topic to this conversation, I guess what I'd like to do is, to your point, Kuldeep, we've been doing this for a while, right? When you think about a shared responsibility model, this isn't something that came about in 2024 or 2020 even. It's been around for a long, long time, probably about as long as the cloud's been around, or Salesforce, right? One of the OGs in the space. So before we introduce a new topic, to the point, we have been doing this for a while. Maybe just go around, kind of the horn here and talk about, Gary, when you're working with a client, where, beyond the identifying, where do you see the opportunity? Like, what's something that you see most organizations needing to tighten up? So before they even think about Gen AI and some of these other things, where is like the low hanging fruit? How, you typically see for an organization to upgrade their security profile?
Yeah, and if I kind of take the other areas of the NIST model really quickly, which you've all talked about already a little bit, Kuldeep and Adam. Identification's done. The next thing is the detect part of the model. So how are you detecting anomalous behavior on your network? Protect. How are you encrypting your data? What policies and practices do you have in place? The two areas that I don't see a lot of maturity in are respond. So if there is an incident, how do you respond? And then how do you recover from that incident? So if I go back to quick wins, most of the time I end up recommending number one, get a reasonably sophisticated logging mechanism in place so that no matter what happens, you've got an ability to know what happened. And then the second one is come up with an incident response plan. The good thing about incident response plans are they're basically free to write one. They don't have to be super complicated. It really just comes down to roles, responsibilities, timelines, expectations if there is ever a suspected incident. So you know whose cell phone number you would have to ping, notification requirements for compliance. That's very easy to do. And then recover sounds really tricky, but for starters, it's like, do you even know if your backups are working? Do you know, have you ever done a test restore in a production environment to validate you can bring something back? And, again, long answer to the TLDR, write an incident response plan, get your backups up and running and test them periodically. Those are the two places for an easy start.
Those are two really nice recommendations, right? To your point, having an incident response plan, that is fairly straightforward and easy to do. Like that's a low lift. What I also really like is that recommendation of, yeah, in today's world, we all have backups, right? But we typically, a lot of organizations aren't testing that backup until something goes bump in the night. And then you're just praying that indeed that works. And that's a really great call out of test your backup and disaster recovery plan. I really like that. Thank you, Gary. Adam, Kuldeep, anything you guys want to add?
Yeah, just a few things, right? One kind of I wanted to recognize, Gary, I started my career as a DBA, and there was a popular saying back there that it's not the backup that got you fired, it's your ability to restore, right? But a great point there. I really appreciate that. Other low-hanging fruits, I mean, I remember from my own experience, right? Whenever this topic comes up as a practitioner, I become the CISO and cybersecurity organization's best friend, right? I mean, because those are the guys who are going to kind of, save the day for me. So encryption is a big deal, especially endpoints, because when you think about the shared responsibility model, while the infrastructure is there, how closely you want to manage your keys and that whole infrastructure is a big deal, right? And so anybody who's listening to this, beyond classification, jump onto encryption and make sure that your endpoints are known. It's an easy thing to do. The architecture is already available. Cloud providers are very good at it. And if you are going to bring your own keys, to keep things very close to your chest, that's another thing to consider. I'll just pause here, Morgan.
Yeah, Adam, anything to add?
I think it's hard to add to that. I'll add another metaphor to the mix, which is I'm thinking about, if you buy like a $5,000 table saw, and it's got a lot of bells and whistles on it, that's great, but you still need to learn how to leverage those. And I'm thinking about how a lot of these platforms that we get onto have fantastic security tools, as Gary alluded to at the beginning. Like they're doing top class work. They are, ISO 27K certified. They have penetration testing teams going in and always checking this stuff out. So sometimes the low hanging fruit is like, take a look at what you already have, what you've already even paid for, and maybe think about like, how could I actually leverage this, right? And it could be any of the things that Gary and Kuldeep mentioned. Just, okay, this is readily available. So just by virtue of accessibility, let's go for it.
And let's stick with you for a minute here, Adam, and let's kind of pivot the conversation. So, what has changed in the tech world over the past couple of years? It is generative AI, and kind of sticking with this concept of, where to start or how to get started. When you see firms looking to adopt or test different generative AI applications, what are some things to consider, in the context of a shared responsibility model, in the context of security, data security, et cetera? Adam, do you have any thoughts there? And then again, we'll just kind of go around the room here.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things to consider. We talked a little about just compliance, like what are the laws? And So I think understanding that first and foremost, because that gives you a framework against which you can start to assess various vendors, and do they give you the tools to be compliant? How difficult is it to get to that place with them? Do they offer contractual terms such as like a zero data retention policy? That's come up a lot in the past few months for me, so it's top of mind. And then I think you really start to get into these questions that we've already touched on, and as I think Kuldeep mentioned, it's things we are doing already or should be doing. So, thinking about governance internally and thinking about what that looks like. So, maybe you have good data governance. If you do, that's great. If you don't, you're probably going to want to take a look at this, because, generative AI or generally AI tools, they can be very useful, but they can also amplify areas where you may have unmet responsibilities. So I often want to think about that when I'm talking with clients, as far as, okay, what do you have today? And, would this satisfy what you need to do going forward? Or do you need to start thinking about this stuff more explicitly?
Yeah, that's a really great point, Adam. And if I can, Kuldeep, maybe let's talk about something that Adam just, kind of brought up, which was, they might, these Gen AI tools might amplify the risks you already have. I think that's a really interesting idea. And maybe, Kuldeep, can you talk a little bit about what some of those risks might be? And then Gary, maybe we can come back to you and talk a little bit about how the cloud platforms are addressing some of those risks, like a Salesforce, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I can do that. Again, in the shared responsibility model, right? When you think about it, and you're thinking about AI, whether it's traditional, here we're talking about Gen AI. If you think IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, right? I mean, IaaS is where you're bringing your model, right? I mean, you are modeling. You are kind of responsible for your data, machine learning practices. You're writing all of these, supervised, unsupervised, routines, and then you're taking all of that. So that whole responsibility is yours, right? Now, when you get into this whole platform as a service, which is where Gen AI comes in. I mean, now you're kind of living in that world where, there's responsibility across the board, right? I mean, many of us are using GPT, for instance, right? And when you think about how GPT was built, it was built on publicly available data, publicly available artifacts, right? I mean, it's bimodal. I mean, it was all sorts of stuff, right? There are conversations happening, there are news articles, there are publicly available research, and there are billions of parameters that's making GPT so powerful. And that's what you're using. You're using somebody else's model that someone else built. And I think the biggest risk in that is explainability, right? I mean, if you're just going after GPT, like right now, I use ChatGPT every day. I mean, generally speaking, for my purpose as a single person, it seems like it's okay, right? It's giving me fairly reasonable answers. But if I go into my prompts and start kind of making more and more, my prompts more complex, at that point, I'm starting to wonder, where is it? Why is it? I have a lot of questions behind what the responses are. Now, just take that and just put that in the context of a global financial services, or take that in the from a perspective of a national healthcare organization, right, or a legal firm, or any of the industries that are very, very highly regulated. The explainability of the model is a big deal, right? And I think that's a huge risk. A garbage in, garbage out, that's never going to go away. Your data, the quality of your data, I think, Adam, you mentioned data governance, right? And if you do not understand where the data started from, where all has it been touched, what transformations have been applied, what's the quality of your data, at that point, you're talking about garbage, right? And that garbage now, through your RAGs, you're going to feed it into your LLMs, like a GPT. Now, garbage and unexplainable, just imagine what the outcome is going to be, right? So just making sure that you have data governance is highly popular now, even way more than what it was 5 years back. And I've been doing data governance for 20 years. So I'm like really happy and doing the happy dance, because finally it's getting the foundational kind of, all of the attention that it needs, right? So make sure that your data is governed, It is of high quality. You know what exactly your data is saying, so that when you feed it into these models and the outputs that you get, are explainable. And we'll talk maybe not in depth in this conversation, but there are a whole bunch of algorithms and methods of making your models more explained. So.
Yeah, and Gary, I guess, I think that's really helpful. And I'd like to talk, come back, to Kuldeep in a minute here and talk about, where could folks get started on explainability. But before we do that, Gary, talking about the different clouds out there and, kind of Salesforce, when you think about what, these large cloud providers are doing, how are they addressing explainability and trust, when it comes to generative AI? Now, how are they thinking about that, that data model, and, are there built-in protections to address some of these issues that Adam and Kuldeep have brought up?
Yeah, and just to add on the risk side, things are changing so incredibly fast. I follow three companies pretty closely: OpenAI, Salesforce, and Google. OpenAI has released several new models in the past 30 days. Salesforce announces Agentforce at Dreamforce, and yesterday I got an email that Agentforce 2.0 is now being released. Google, I think that they're lockstep with Salesforce, announces Gemini 2.0 all of a sudden. So things are changing so quickly that the underlying rules of the game, or how these platforms are working, is changing. So when we talk about explainability, that is definitely a big challenge. So when we start to talk about risk mitigation, first, I look at that as two ways. Number one, just the way that your app performs can create its own risks. I saw an amazing demo of a pharmaceutical parsing platform that would parse dozens of pages of doctor's notes into a summary. And I watched this awesome demo. It was amazing, as a huge time saver. Parse 1 milligram on the doctor's notes to 1 gram on the summary, and that's 1,000 times 100,000x error on the dosage that they recommended. So those are like the normal risks. When we talk about cybersecurity, really focusing on Salesforce, they created an abstraction layer. They call it the Einstein Trust layer, which essentially gives a Salesforce admin, developer, consultant the ability to pass everything through this layer, which it offers a series of controls. You can have it block or obfuscate data. It will tokenize everything in the session to that particular conversation. But again, it still creates a lot to think about, because on the other side of the model, Salesforce has a drop-down list. It's like, do you want to use GPT? Do you want to use Gemini? Do you want to use your own model? A Salesforce admin could be inventing these amazing things, but if you're not really digging in and asking the right questions of how your own team is building these things, they could be leveraging third or fourth party technology that are outside the scope of your cybersecurity landscape and doing things that you're not ready for. So bringing it all the way back, I think it's know what your team is doing internally, and then look at those features of the software, like the Einstein Trust layer, that give you the opportunity to minimize risk every step of the way. So go.
Yeah, and I think that really is the theme of this conversation. It's the tools you're using, the cloud tools you're using do have some pretty good out of the box, security mechanisms today. And so being aware of what those are and how you're using them, are you not using them? Right. So being aware of that is really important, and utilizing what comes out of the box is important. And then to your point, understanding how your team is behaving within those kind of guardrails is also really important. So identifying and understanding the risks specific to your organization that you're putting into these tools is really important. I think this is, those are two really clear takeaways, for me, and I hope that those are takeaways for other folks on the call. Coming back to, if we can just add one extra little bell or whistle here, kind of outside of what the tools have, and maybe outside of kind of identifying, understanding the data and who has access to that data. Kuldeep, can we come back to you? And if you were to say, hey, here's the way to get started on explainability, what's a suggestion or a recommendation you'd have for those who are just, trying to get exposed to this concept or this idea?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the biggest deal, again, I kind of, the reason I'm going back to the data, right, is your data. I mean, you need to be able to explain your data, first of all, right? I mean, do you have access to good, clean data? I'm assuming at this point that we've taken care of, the security aspects, we've taken care of, the infrastructure aspects, identity and access management, right? However, for those who are entering the Gen AI realm, right? One of the features of Gen AI is the more data that you feed to it, the better off your end results are going to be, right? However, that needs to be a little bit more curated, right? It's not like you're dumping all sorts of data into towards your LLMs. So if you're thinking about in an organization, data is not just structured, it's also unstructured. And I mean, however, the modal models are getting better, where you can kind of extract all sorts of information and then flow it through your system, right? So that's one aspect of what you need to kind of worry about, right? Is your data, which is the input. So it's like almost like an analogy, right? I mean, it's not only just really awesome to build a beautiful house and a front door, right? But you need to know who is allowed through the front door. So make sure that you're kind of focusing on the input, which is the door to Gen AI. However, once you are in the realm and the explainability, I mean, I think the things that we worry about with models, right, and they are also relevant here, is just the model drift. There are other things like bias. There is, all of those things have to be managed, right? And generally, the way you manage them is that there are either, features that are available through the cloud vendor, or you can kind of, there are all these other frameworks that are available to you. Like, and one of the ones that you and I have spoken about, Morgan, in our previous conversation was the SHAP and LIME, right? I mean, these are explainability frameworks that are available that you can bolt on top of some of what you're already doing, right, as part of your general development activity. But essentially, I mean, I think keeping it simple here, making sure that your prompts that you're feeding into your models, right, there is some kind of an engineering and some kind of a governance around the prompts that you're writing and then you're feeding your models. Then once the models are kind of operating and they are in an execution kind of a mode, then you're kind of either making use of all of the features that are already available through the cloud vendor, or you're bringing frameworks from outside, just like the couple that I mentioned. And then I think the biggest thing here, right, that people forget sometimes is the human in the loop, right? At the end of the day, what are you doing, right? You're presenting it with a problem, and then you're getting an insight or a solution back, right? And that has to be verified. In many cases, it's been automated, and that we are heading towards the autonomous kind of nature. And I think, Gary, you mentioned all of the agents that are going to show up here very soon, right? We are moving away from Gen AI being a knowledge-based system to more of an action-based system, right, where action can be taken. However, the humans in the loop are the biggest, and I'll keep it as simple as that. I mean, they're the biggest auditors, or they're the most effective auditors of the insights that are coming out, because you don't want the insights that are coming out of these models to be black box. You want them to be white box. If they need to be explained, they need to be explained to regulators. They need to be explained to your customers, right, your clients, depending upon which industry you are in. But essentially, to summarize here, my thought process is good data, good prompts, making sure that you have a very good prompt engineering practice, making sure that you're using the filtering capabilities and explainability and bias capabilities that are already available through the cloud service providers, but then also bringing in your own methodology, right, through external frameworks and bolting them on top of your models and your entire workflow. So I'll just pause here.
Yeah, and I know we're starting to come to the end, and so just kind of going around, I think Gary, you've gave us a number of nuggets kind of to chew on and to think about. I think that NIST framework and anchoring in the NIST framework is really important. If you were to give any other kind of suggestions or resources as people are starting to think through what does security look like in a Gen AI world, and how does a shared responsibility model still apply in Gen AI? Do you have any other kind of resources or places you might point folks to kind of beyond NIST? And Adam and Kuldeep, I'd ask you the same question of where could folks go to learn more?
Yeah, so I think too, I mean, Nest is a absolutely amazing resource. Another area, again, this is all free. It's a nonprofit, Center for Information Security, CIS. They have a very detailed framework for organizations called critical security controls. It's a set of 21 topics that you go through, and it helps you reduce risk across the board. So they're a great resource, and um, we've written a number of kind of easily consumable Salesforce-based resources on the Red Argyle resources page. So feel free to check that out. There's 4 or 5 options there, all free. Just download them. There's templates, and we even have one that has a sample incident response plan baked in there and all that stuff. So they're all out there as well.
And if there are people on the call who maybe aren't Salesforce, could they still leverage potentially that incident response plan as just kind of a template or a way to think about getting started?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all the resources, there might be a Salesforce veneer on them, but a lot of it's universal knowledge, particularly the CIS, which I can't remember the URL off the top of my head, but they serve every industry globally and with just a great wealth of knowledge.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Gary. Adam, Kuldeep, what resources might you point someone to if they're starting to, kind of think about this and they want to go a little bit deeper?
So I can get started here, Adam, and I'll hand it over to you. My go-to is NIST, right? I mean, you go there, you get a really good understanding of the entire landscape. So thank you for sharing that, Gary. But beyond that, because there are different people in the audience, possibly, right? People who are focused on security, people who are focused on data, applications. And so given that my focus is more on data, there are multiple resources. NIST talks about the responsible AI framework, which I think was released in 2023. Or Gen AI was released in 2023. AI was released in 2022. So read that. That's a very, very detailed, and it's not just a document that you read, it also can be implemented, right? So that's the key thing. Responsible AI, if you are really heading into Gen AI and AI in a big way, become a member of Responsible AI. I'm a member there. Really great articles, really great frameworks coming out of there. If you're working in Europe, there is Artificial Intelligence Governance Association. Look at them, AIGA. They have a very, very good framework for implementing AI and Gen AI in a large corporate environment, especially more focused on EU AI Act. But then even for the data, the classical data guys in the audience, I would say, if you look at DGIs and the DCAMs and other models by IBM and other, these models have existed for a while, especially the data governance models. They all have a responsible AI twist on top of it. So I think, just look at all of that. At Hike2, we have our own framework, which is a culmination of a lot of these different frameworks, but also how do you now take these frameworks and actually apply them in a company's context, right? Which is more of a practitioner's point of view. Happy to kind of, at some point, talk about that in detail as well. Adam?
I think between Gary and Kuldeep, that's a lot of resources. I'm not sure I have anything that would be additive to that. I guess what I would say is that, like anything, right, start small, start with the acorn, not the oak tree. It's a journey. And as Gary mentioned, it is rapidly changing. So try to find those foundational resources, try to understand conceptually, the shared responsibility model. If you still have open questions, start there. Microsoft, Salesforce, Google Cloud Platform all have great documentation. And then I would just say, pick the areas that feel most relevant to your business and start to pursue those. And this may sound cheeky, but you could actually, ask ChatGPT to come up with an outline of the 10 most important things that you need to understand here, and it'll do an okay job.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, Kuldeep, Gary. I mean, that's fantastic insight. I love the recommendations. Again, bringing it back to, understanding what are the resources and the capabilities within the platform you're already working in, and then understanding the risks that your organization, through the types of data you have and the people and the access to that data, what are the risks associated by the data you're putting in that platform are like great places to start. I think the resources you all named were amazing and lovely. Kalia, do we have any questions from the audience?
I didn't see any come in, but as we go to wrap up just now, if anybody wants to use this last moment to sort of raise their hand, they're absolutely welcome to do so. And in the meanwhile, I will just give a plug for the deeper version of this same session, which will happen after the first of the year. So January 28th, we're going to go into some more detail, kind of taking the next step in the maturity model around the shared responsibility concepts overall. But this has been a fantastic conversation, gentlemen. You've really broken things down in a really great way. And this is an all-star team. So I'm personally looking forward to the next one as well. So with that, I don't see any questions coming in, so I will let everybody go. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for following us. You can find the recording of this on YouTube. We're looking forward to the next session, and happy holidays to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.